When you think of the American Civil War, you immediately think of muskets, cannons, and bayonets. But did you know it was also a proving ground for some of the earliest landmines and hand grenades? Those crude yet innovative weapons brought unseen dangers to the battlefield and influenced the way future wars were fought. Today, we'll look at how they were used, who used them, and the battles where they made history. The mid-19th century was a time of incredible technological innovation, and the American Civil War became a laboratory for new weapons. Repeating rifles, breech-loading cannon, and submarines were introduced, and both the Union and Confederacy experimented with explosives beyond the traditional cannonballs and shells. Landmines, known then as torpedoes, had been theorized in earlier conflicts, but this war saw their first widespread use on American soil. Hand grenades, on the other hand, had their origins in the 17th century. Yet it was during the Civil War that these devices evolved into compact and practical tools for close-quarters combat. These weren't the sleek, modern designs we think of today. They were clunky, dangerous, and often as much a threat to their users as to the enemy. Still, they showed the growing importance of ingenuity in warfare. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac's Chief of Artillery described one example of these crude devices. Quote, "These shells were the ordinary 8 or 10-inch mortar or columbiad shells filled with powder, buried a few inches below the surface of the ground, and so arranged with some fulminate, or with the ordinary artillery friction primer, that they exploded by being trod upon or otherwise disturbed." Unquote. The Union and Confederacy each had their own approaches to these weapons. The Confederacy leaned heavily on landmines, although their use was strongly debated within the Southern government. Confederate proponents, like Gabriel Rains, argued that landmines were essential for compensating for the South's lack of manpower and resources, and saw mines as a legitimate means of defending strategic positions and slowing Union advances. Rains argued that landmines were for protecting vulnerable areas, such as roads, bridges, and fortifications, allowing smaller Confederate forces to hold off larger Union armies. Northern opinion on the Confederacy's use of landmines were overwhelmingly negative, with many viewing them as unethical and cowardly. The hidden nature of landmines, designed to kill or maim unsuspecting soldiers, was seen as a violation of traditional battlefield norms that valued open combat. Key criticisms on the use of landmines. Many Union leaders and soldiers considered landmines to be dishonorable. They believed that hiding explosive devices for unsuspecting enemies went against the perceived chivalry of warfare, where battles were fought openly and face-to-face. Landmines were criticized for their cruelty, as they indiscriminately harmed soldiers and civilians alike. The wounds they inflicted were seen as particularly gruesome and disproportionate to their tactical benefits. Northern newspapers and officials often used the Confederacy's reliance on landmines as propaganda, portraying the South as desperate and willing to resort to barbaric methods to compensate for its dwindling resources. This rhetoric reinforced the Union's moral high ground in the conflict, particularly in the context of a war framed as a fight for liberation and justice. On a practical level, Union soldiers expressed frustration and fear when encountering landmines. These devices forced them to adopt slower and more cautious approaches, which delayed advances and increased psychological strain. Union General William T. Sherman condemned the use of landmines and declared their use as not warfare, but murder. Sherman's opinion reflected widespread condemnation. However, some Union forces adapted to the threat by developing tactics to detect and neutralize mines, demonstrating a grudging acknowledgement of their effectiveness in certain contexts. The Union, with its industrial advantage, focused more on hand grenades. The most common was the Ketchum grenade, a strange-looking device resembling a dart, complete with fins for stabilization. Soldiers would throw these at enemy fortifications, hoping they'd detonate on impact. The design wasn't perfect. If the grenade landed wrong, it could fail to explode, or worse, explode prematurely. These weapons were used in several engagements. One of the most notable uses of landmines was during the siege of Petersburg, where Confederate forces laid explosive traps along critical defensive lines. Union soldiers advancing through these areas faced devastating casualties, creating a psychological toll that slowed their progress. Meanwhile, at the siege of Vicksburg, Union troops made extensive use of Ketchum grenades during their assaults on Confederate fortifications. One famous anecdote tells of Confederate soldiers catching grenades thrown into their trenches and tossing them back, a literal game of hot potato, but with deadly stakes. These moments underscore the experimental nature of these weapons. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Overall, landmines and grenades were more impactful as psychological tools and precursors to later military technologies than as decisive factors in Civil War strategies. They forced some adaptations in tactics, particularly in siege warfare, but their relatively primitive designs and inconsistent success limited their broader influence. These weapons, however, laid the groundwork for the more sophisticated explosives that would dominate 20th century conflicts. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Civil War technology, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what topic you'd like to see next. Until then, keep exploring the past to understand the present.